Good afternoon, and thank you for attending today's webinar. My name is Jennifer Cooley, and I am the Education and Outreach Manager for the State Historical Museum. Thank you for attending the Iowa History 101 webinar series today, focusing on how temperance movement and prohibition affected Iowans from all walks of life. The Iowa History 101 series takes place on the second and fourth Thursdays through August as we share stories about the past lives of Iowans. Please refer to our website at iowaculture.gov/history to learn more about this series and our other virtual programs, including the Toward a Universal Suffrage webinar on July 7 about African American women in Iowa and their efforts to help everyone get the right to vote. This webinar is part of the museum's programming for the 19th Amendment Centennial Celebration. A few housekeeping points before I introduce our speaker. Everyone came into this webinar on mute with cameras off. The webinar is being recorded and will be placed on the Iowa Culture page of YouTube in a few days. I have disabled the chat function, but if you have a question, please type them into the Q&A feature throughout the webinar. My colleague Matt Beyer is watching that feature and will prepare a list of questions for the speaker at the end of the presentation, but please note we may not be able to get to all of the questions. Now I'm happy to introduce our speaker, State Curator Leo Landis. Leo has his Bachelor's of Science in History from Iowa State University and a Master's of Arts in Historical Administration from Eastern Illinois University. He has completed all but his dissertation towards a PhD in history from Iowa State University. His museum experience includes time at Living History Farms in Urbandale, Connor Prairie in Fishers, Indiana, and 8 years as curator at the Henry Ford Museum in Greenfield Village in Dearborn, Michigan. He has also worked as a curator and director of education at Salisbury House in Des Moines. Now I'm very happy to turn it over to Leo to begin the webinar.
Well, thank you, Jennifer, and it's great to have everyone here again today. And today, as Jennifer said, and you can see on the slide, we're going to be talking about Iowa and temperance and prohibition. The topic is really one that is one of tragedy and one of the more compelling stories in our state's history. And it was at times contentious. Some of the things I'll share will be amusing at times, but it really was, other than race relations, the defining topic of Iowa history from statehood to the mid-20th century. So with that, we'll talk about temperance beginnings, then temperance in Iowa before and into the Civil War, then a period shortly after the Civil War until 1886, and then the progressive era into Prohibition. So let's do a little bit of a timeline. So Prohibition and temperance is really the 19th century phrase because it was a self-monitoring behavior where you made the choice on your own to be temperate, to either abstain or in small amounts drink appropriately, and generally for men especially. And this came out of the Second Great Awakening, religious movement of the early 19th century, the early 1800s. And those were the faith traditions of what is today the United Methodist Church, to a degree the Baptist Church, other longer established religions such as the Congregationalists and others were part of the temperance movement. And it was part of the reform movement of the reform movements of that first half of the 19th century as well, the first half of the 1800s. So it really then takes off beginning in the 1820s. So you get the first really national event organization, the American Society for the Promotion of Temperance in Boston in 1826. The Washingtonian movement, Washingtonian, there we go. Washingtonian movement was dedicated to President George Washington and was really a temperance movement in its purest form, talking about you were going to promote voluntary abstention from alcohol, so that it was a voluntary act. Again, that was part of that temperance movement. And so when we become a state in late 1846, The Iowa General Assembly very quickly passes the first law. First law is restricting alcohol in that first legislative session of 1847. And then the 19th century term for bars was dram shops. So you'll see that term used, and the General Assembly in 1851 passed a law barring all dram shops. This was concurrent with what is the first national or first state to pass a prohibition law is Maine in 1851. So in the 1850s and to the 1860s, if you are reading and you see something referencing the Maine law, that's referring to a prohibition law. In 1855, the Iowa legislature banned alcohol, but would later allow beer, apple cider, and wine. And that's part of the debate that goes on through the period as well, is that, liquor versus lighter alcoholic beverages. So things like beer, apple cider, and wine not having as high an alcohol content as whiskey or other spirituous liquors was viewed as more acceptable. Then 1874, the Women's Christian Temperance Union is founded, and an Iowa chapter is organized that same month. So that's a national organization where women really start to assert themselves in the prohibition and temperance debate. 1879, a state protective association is founded, and that's a counter to the WCTU. So if I say WCTU, know that I'm talking about the Women's Christian Temperance Union. The State Protective Association is organized to say there's an economic impact to this temperance movement. And so the State Protective Association is founded to publicize the economic damage from liquor regulation. So there are reactions all through the history. Then in 1882, and you can almost always look to the Iowa Republican Party as a reform party going back to its abolitionist roots in the 1850s as being on the side of prohibition in Iowa. So it passed, a constitutional amendment passes two successive legislative sessions, two concurrent legislative sessions, and then it goes to the governor, it is signed. It's challenged because the two bills that passed the session had different language. And so the Iowa Supreme Court then strikes down that constitutional change. Supporters of that amendment were the Sons of Temperance, the Order of Good Templars, and then the Iowa State Temperance Alliance. That's the organization that's co-ed, is the Iowa State Temperance Alliance. And so it's a spokes group for the temperance movement and is co-ed, whereas the Sons of Temperance and the Order of Good Templars are largely male. In 1884, then, after the Prohibition Amendment is struck from the Iowa Constitution or ruled not viable, the legislature passes a prohibition law. It was in dispute until 1888, but remains in effect until 1894. And so that is a statewide prohibition law that technically is in effect until 1894. On the national scene in 1893, the Anti-Saloon League is founded in Ohio. That's the organization that really gets behind and creates chapters all across the United States that promotes a national prohibition movement. So the Anti-Saloon League is significant in the national story. And then in 1915, the Iowa local option law is ended. Prohibition becomes effective in Iowa before national prohibition. So Iowa is a leader in prohibition, whether you like that or not. We're ahead of the national curve. And then in 1919, the Volstead Act, named for the Minnesota representative in the US House. He was the chair of the Judiciary Committee in the House, Volstead. That bill is passed in 1919, and it takes effect on January 17th, 1920. We'll go a little bit beyond that 1919 date as we wrap up. We'll talk about the end of Prohibition. But those are the benchmarks leading up to Prohibition in the history of Iowa and temperance. So talking about that early temperance movement, here's a great little poem that was printed in the Montpelier, Vermont Freeman's Press in 1810. So you start seeing this, as we said, in the early 1800s. And I didn't look, but I can almost guarantee this got published in other newspapers as well. And it's titled A Mortal Thermometer, showing the effects of temperance and intemperance. So water, milk, and water, and small beer produce health, wealth, serenity of mind, reputation, long life, and happiness. Cider, wine, porter, and strong beer, taken only at meals and in moderate quantities, produce cheerfulness, strength, and nourishment. Punch, grog, brandy, and water produce idleness, sickness, and debt. Drams, taken in the morning, produce dropsy, palsy, and consumption, and lead to rags, hunger, the hospital, the poorhouse, or a jail. Drams during the day and night produce apoplexy, madness, and suicide, and lead to the gallows. So this is part of the whole argument about not being temperate, and especially drinking that harder liquor, is going to lead to ruin for you and eventually your family if you are a male. And again, this is these are arguments largely made against men, and the United States was, especially US men, were drinking lots and lots of alcohol, especially whiskey and beer, and it's because corn is easily and more transportable in a liquid form to a degree than it is as a commodity like today. And in fact, you start to see cartoons all through the pre-1860 era. These are two examples in the Library of Congress collection. On the left is the tree of intemperance, and on the right is the tree of temperance. And I'll give you a little better view of these two, but the tree of intemperance, of course, has the serpent, so a very biblical motif there. And its roots are the various alcoholic beverages, and then the branches are intemperance and immorality, diseases corporeal, diseases corporeal. Let's make that a little bigger for you. So there you see the roots. You've got things like whiskey and wine and brandy and cider and gin and lager beer. And on the left side of the image, of course, you've got the temperance men who are upstanding and well-behaved and organized. And then on the right side, you've got fallen men and drunken men, men with a goat or a dog. I'm not quite sure what the small animal figure is that's with them. And then all the branches, whether it be the immorality branch or the vice branch or the crime branch or the disease corporeal branch, all lead to different downfalls of humanity, especially of manhood. And you see the temperance man chopping at the roots there of the intemperance tree. So these are the sort of motifs that are being used to popularize why it's important to be temperate. And then on the right side, the tree of temperance, you've got this, beautiful scene with lovely people. The tree of temperance has industry, humility, sobriety, contentment, philanthropy, goodness, fidelity, gentleness, obedience, knowledge, virtue, morality, salvation, patriotism, all good things. You've got the church on the right. You've got what one presumes is a lovely town hall or community hall there on the left. And so these are the sort of popular cartoons, political imagery that's being used to promote temperance. And as a earlier version, Nathaniel Currier, who would go on to partner with Ives to be Currier and Ives, he did this one, The Fruits of Temperance, that says, "Behold the son of temperance, with buoyant heart and step returning to his home, the partner of his bosom looks up and makes him welcome. His children fly to meet him, their little arms embrace him, and each with lip and heart they bless him." So Again, you've got the model community with a industrial furnace or factory on the left, and the other, perhaps a mill or other factory, and a town hall, and a lovely scene here showing the importance and the benefits to being temperate. So those images on the page before and also following are all both in the Library of Congress collection, so you can get better views on their site if you wish. So even in territorial days, temperance is something that's being promoted in Iowa. And if you do newspaper research or look at other accounts of Iowa and the territorial period into early statehood, you'll see temperance meetings being commented all through the history of our state. And sometimes it'll be Washingtonian groups, sometimes it's an individual temperance organization. And so this one is from the Bloomington Herald. That was what Muscatine was known as when it was first established, May 31st, 1844. And it's about the organization of a temperance society in Bloomington. So not the town in Davis County today, but what is today Muscatine. And it's talking about the organization of the Temperance Society, and that they will be taking the pledge. And so the names are hereto subscribed, having a desire to carry out the true principles of temperance, do hereby mutually pledge our honor to each other that we will refrain from the use of all intoxicating drinks as a beverage. So this is where you're taking a pledge to say, any beverage that's intoxicating, we have taken a pledge to abstain. So it's voluntary, and I think it's in this too, or in some of the other bylaws, it goes on to say on most of these that should someone fail in their pledge, they'll be welcomed back as long as they agree to stay temperate again. So it was always a welcoming, or generally a welcoming. Yeah, it says in Article 4, may be a little tough for you to see on your screen, that no penalty shall be applied to any member who shall violate his pledge. It shall be the duty of every member to use his unfortunate brother with all charity and by early means of persuasion, and induce him to covenant anew. So to take the pledge again, and to strictly observe his pledge by again signing his name. So even if you were to fail in your efforts, you'd be welcomed back. We also have in our collections, a certificate for an organization in Scott County, the Brotherhood of Temperance Watchmen. And this is one where it references that main law in the script there, where it says, these certify that Brother Richard J. Craig Jr. was duly initiated a member of Maine Law Club. So that's why they're in the early 1850s using that term Maine law, connected to the idea that liquor should be prohibited. So this is a group that was in Scott County. You see what could be Columbia, the figure of America, or perhaps just a classic figure. She has 3 ribbons of temperance, humanity, and progress. And it lists the pledge that each member would take as well to abstain from alcohol. So it was a point of pride in many communities to be listed as a member of a temperance society in your community, and fit well within the reform movements and the religious practices that were generally Protestant in most of these communities. That's not to say that people of the Jewish faith primarily, and Catholic on the Christian side, weren't occasionally members of these groups, but it tended to be Protestants, if not exclusively Protestants. And it's talking about the people coming to Iowa, and also the events that they had experienced prior to their settling in Iowa in that early statehood period, and then up to and immediately after the Civil War. Emily Hawley, and then she marries James Gillespie, so she becomes Emily Hawley Gillespie in her diary that's in our Iowa City collections. She talks about her life in Lenawee County in her diary, and she says, on September 7th, 1859, this evening, Ella, that's her sister, this evening, Ella and I attend a temperance lecture. Lessons well learned, pleasant, and that's reflecting the weather. And so the people who had come to Iowa in that early statehood period and are living here, primarily Protestants, and have been exposed to the experiences of temperance and temperance movements in their home states. And so then Emily, when she's in Iowa in 1874, talks about going to the Presbyterian meeting. Very good. After supper, we attend temperance mass meeting. It was indeed quite interesting. It is the first time we were in the new city hall. It will be a beautiful room when completed. And so Emily is still paying attention to the suffrage activities concurrent with the temperance activities concurrent with the creation of the WCTU, and is active in going to temperance lectures in her home community. And as I said, this is from the Diaries of Emily Hawley Gillespie. The book is of the transcript is A Secret to be Buried by Judy Nolte Linsink, and she worked with our collections in Iowa City to develop that. And I've tried to work in a photo of me every time. Either my wife or I took the photo of her grave. So I've been to Emily Hawley Gillespie's grave in Manchester, Iowa, up in Delaware County in Northeast Iowa. So you don't get a photo of me, you get a photo by me, or a photo that my wife took. When the Women's Christian Temperance Union is founded, an Iowan is the first director or first head of the WCTU, and that's Annie Wittenmyer. She had spent much of her time in Keokuk and then moves to Davenport in Scott County. The Soldiers Orphan Home in Davenport was the Annie Wittenmyer home, and she goes on then to change from soldiers' welfare, which she cared about in the Civil War, and build her national prominence to take on another reform cause, the Temperance Crusade. And she writes a book that's available through Google Books, and she references some of the activities of chapters of temperance organizations across the United States. And again, this is largely a northern movement too. It comes out of New England and the mid-Atlantic states, and then spreads into the Midwest. The WCTU, she has this little poem that says, a pledge we make no wine to take, or brandy red to turn the head, or whiskey hot to make the sot, or fiery rum that ruins home. Nor will we sin by drinking gin, hard cider too will never do, or brewer's beer the heart to cheer. To quench our thirst we'll always bring cold water from the well or spring. Also from tobacco's use we plead excuse, the filth and scent thus we prevent, that does accrue from snuff and chew. And smoke we abhor from pipe or cigar, to this pledge we live for the joy it will give to fathers and mothers, our neighbors and others. So again, teaching children little rhymes that would promote good health, temperance, and in this case, abstaining from tobacco as well. So Annie Wittenmyer, there's a schism within the temperance movement of the 1870s where Ms. Wittenmyer is dedicated solely to temperance. Frances Willard, Frances Willard, who goes on to be the head of the WCTU, also is advocating for women's suffrage. And that causes a schism, and Annie Wittenmyer then is forced out as the head of the WCTU, and Francis Willard takes over. But that's an Iowa connection. Wittenmyer had then moved to the Philadelphia area later in her life, and so that's a photograph from the Pittsburgh area, so Western Pennsylvania, but she lived the remainder of her life in the Philadelphia area. Nevertheless, Iowans, especially Germans and Irish and Czechs, especially Catholics, whose cultural traditions think that individual choice and responsible consumption of alcohol is appropriate, are actively engaged in industries connected to the production and sale of alcohol. So here you've got Almonds Brewery from here in Des Moines at 226 Elm Street. It's a photograph from about 1875. You see there's some kegs next to the men at the front of the brewery there. And also you've got the train car off to the right. They may have been shipping beer out of Des Moines as well. So you do see breweries and production of alcohol on small and mid-sized scale across our state, especially in communities with a German or an Irish population. As we said, Czech communities in East Central and Northeast Iowa, and then later in the 1800s in Western Iowa, where you see German and Irish communities as well. The consumption of alcohol is viewed as an individual choice. And as we referenced earlier, there had been that constitutional effort to change the Iowa Constitution to prohibit liquor and make that part of our state constitution. And it was something that the Republican Party, following the Civil War, with its support, and the Party of Abolitionism and the Party of the Union, really was the dominant party through the 1920s into the 1930s in Iowa. We'll talk about a couple of times when it wasn't, but the Republican Party really was the Prohibition Party. So when you talk about the creation of the Prohibition Party in the United States, you do see candidates in Iowa on occasion. It really is not a major factor in the state. It's the Republican Party. And so here's a photograph from our collections in Des Moines of the legislators who voted for Prohibition in 1884. And when that law went into effect, there were some federal issues connected to it as well. And this is why you'll see in river towns, and we'll talk about 1886 as an important year, there's some really great articles that we'll send out to you in an email tomorrow in our Annals of Iowa and our palimpsest that talk about some of those issues in the 1880s. But Governor Larrabee then issues an executive proclamation saying the prohibition law passed in 1884 must be enforced and there will be no clemency. So this is one of those things where I like to point out in the proclamation, Governor Larrabee has it written that whereas the people of this state at a nonpartisan election held on the 20th day of June AD 1882 expressed themselves in favor of prohibiting the sale of intoxicating liquors as a beverage. Well, he says the people, that again, it's the men of the state. And so part of the language that does get used, it talks about the people, but in this case, in a nonpartisan election in 1882, it's going to be the men. And then it talks about how the General Assembly enacted a law with such an expression, so the 20th General Assembly and then the 21st, so those are the two successive assemblies that vote to amend the Constitution, and that it was signed, but because of the differences in the language, it was disallowed by the Iowa Supreme Court, and so then the law was passed again. And Governor Larrabee concludes the proclamation saying, "Let the priests, ministers, teachers, and press use their best efforts to enlist the moral forces of the state in this cause. Let the judges, attorneys, and other officers of the court be painstaking and persistent in enforcing the law, both in letter and in spirit. Let the sheriffs and peace officers be fearless and vigilant, and let the mayors and all other municipal officers awaken to new zeal in their efforts to secure its observance." Well, the challenge is, especially in river communities like Keokuk and Davenport, Bellevue, Clinton, Dubuque, up to McGregor on the eastern border, or Sioux City down to Council Bluffs, all the way down to towns like Glenwood just off the river a little bit in southwest Iowa. If there isn't a prohibition law, alcohol can come across the border and supply Iowans that way. And in fact, the United States Supreme Court had ruled that it was acceptable for vendors to sell alcohol that had been brought in from across a state's border. So that was the case through the 1880s. So this 1886 effort, and it was a point of contention in Keokuk especially, and in Sioux City, as we'll see, with some efforts to really rein in the sale of alcohol. And it led to the defeat of a Republican mayor in Keokuk. And in the case of Sioux City, on August 3rd, 1886, the assassination of a Methodist minister. So this is part of the tragedy and violence that takes place in our state connected to Prohibition. Reverend George Haddock, a Methodist minister in Sioux City, had been patrolling the saloons, making sure they weren't selling in 1886. And he had gone to a nearby community on August 3rd, had come back to a livery stable to return the team of horses he had been having pull his carriage. And as he's leaving the livery stable the night of August 3rd, someone shoots him and kills him. People are charged. One man is convicted eventually, but then is given clemency or is pardoned, connected to whether it was a fair trial and whether he was truly the assassin. And so no one is ever convicted of the murder of Reverend Haddock of Sioux City. Sioux City actually had a marker in the street at the site of the assassination, and now that's in the collections of the Sioux City Public Museum. And in 2017, a permanent memorial or a substantial memorial was put up to Reverend Haddock as well. It had been just a little iron or cast metal disc that was in the road where Reverend Haddock was assassinated. So again, you can see activities around this are tragic at times, and people are taking their personal liberty and the law very seriously, and Haddock was seen as being going outside the bounds of what was appropriate. And so vigilantes in Sioux City were first threatening them or him, and the situation escalated, and Reverend Haddock was assassinated, was murdered. Now, most of the organizations really are more moderate in their behavior, but even the Women's Christian Temperance Union is at times radicalized and engages in activity. And so you start to see critiques even of their behavior from the proponents of temperance, or the proponents, I should say, of legal consumption of alcohol. And as I said, the Prohibition Party is around in Iowa, but it really on the state level, and it does put forward candidates for state offices. This is the 1892 election ticket. It's the first year that Iowa had an official ticket. Up until 1906, the governor was elected in odd number years. So the governor does not show up on this 1892 ticket. But you do see the Prohibition Party as the third party listed. And because this was the first time Iowa had an official ballot, no longer a ticket where you went to the specific party you supported and asked them for how you were going to vote. So if you were a Republican, you asked your Republican Party for a Republican ticket that only had Republican candidates. If you were a Democrat, you'd go to your Democratic Party and ask them for the ticket with only the Democrats on it. And so straight party voting was something that goes back to our early statehood and early nationalhood. It's something that goes back and forth. The way you marked a straight party ticket when it was first created then was to put an X in the upper circle adjacent to the party name. So this Carroll Sentinel ballot example is showing how to vote a straight party ticket on the Democratic side. Not sure if that's connected to the large Catholic population in Carroll County who would have tended to vote Democratic at that time, or whether that just happens to be how the ballot was created, and so they put that X there. But you can see there's a national prohibition candidate for president. Usually on the governor's side in Iowa, the Prohibition Party in Iowa really was the Republican Party. And so even if the Prohibition Party put up a candidate, they tended to get less than 3% of the total vote from Iowa men in these elections. They did not do well. The People's Party, just to point out there on the right, was what was commonly referred to as the Populist Party. And the candidate on that side is James B. Weaver, who was from the town of Bloomfield, had been a US congressman from the town of Bloomfield in Davis County. So he was a national candidate and actually received more than 20 electoral votes in 1892. As we said, the presence of saloons and alcoholic establishments didn't cease even in the case of that 1886 law in communities. It went to local enforcement even in the 1880s because there was no statewide police force, there was no state patrol at the time. And so it really was up to individual communities. So persisting through the 1880s into the 1890s, you saw saloons, and then after 1894, when things were legal again, across the state or left to the local option as the German and Irish population and later the Italian, the Czechs were around by that time. Hansen is typically with an E-N, a Danish name. So perhaps this was a Danish Lutheran who supported the individual rights of people to consume alcohol. And this shot is from about 4 blocks away from where I am today. I'm at the State Historical Building. So you can see it's at 221 East Locust Street is the address of that establishment. And there's a really excellent piece that University of Iowa professor Glenn Erstein and his student Lucas Gibbs, the newspaper called The State and Sieger by Joseph Eibach. He was a German immigrant to Iowa. He published a paper out of Des Moines, and they translated a piece that Eibach did in 1900 about prohibition. And also at the time, Eibach, as you can see, was a big proponent of individual liberty. And so he supported local option. He supported the legal sale of alcohol. And he ran a cartoon. I think this is an 1889 cartoon, and it says Prohibition killed it. The hat, it's in German and abbreviated, but the man in bed is the Republican Party, and that's Temperance in the bottle next to him, and the doctors monitoring him. This is connected to the election of Governor Horace Boyes, who had been a Republican, converts to the Democratic Party because he supports local option. And so Horace Boyes from Waterloo, one-time Republican, is the first Democrat elected governor since the 1850s in Iowa. So Eibach did this political cartoon in his newspaper talking about at least the short-term end of the Republican Party. And that's part of that debate, and that'll be one of the links we send to you, is the link to the translated Prohibition Plague article that gives the German perspective on Prohibition in the year 1900. So really great cartoon, just reflecting the Iowa perspective from an anti-Prohibition advocate. One of the better known names then on the national stage is Carrie Nation out of Kansas. Her real name was Carrie Moore. And in late 1900, she begins doing raids across parts of Kansas and destroying private property in the name of prohibition. And so she takes her axe with her, and this is an account from the Wichita Daily Beacon of an attack she made in Wichita in late December 1900, and destroying a saloon in Wichita. And this has an effect in Iowa, believe it or not. So here's an article from the Iowa City Press Citizen. It's actually in response to a story that the Des Moines Register had picked up, describing, in the Des Moines Register, it was described as a pair of women destroying a saloon in the little town of Oxford in Johnson County, and that they had hatchets. So this is March of 1901, a few months after Carrie Nation's activities. And Mrs. Darner and her daughter-in-law had gone to the saloon because Mrs. Darner's daughter, her daughter-in-law's husband, or Mrs. Darner's son, and thus her daughter-in-law's husband, had been wasting his money at the saloon in Oxford. And the Des Moines Register account says, that they destroy the place. And the corrected version that runs in the Iowa City Press Citizen says, no, the only thing that they really did was to break 3 glasses of beer, or 1 glass of beer and a couple of bottles. So you say, okay, that's an Iowa kind of Carrie Nation activity. What I knew a small reference to from my time at Salisbury House was another story. And so let's talk about Centerville, Iowa in late March, early April of 1901 and through the month. So I only knew about one of these initially, but beginning on March 30th, a group of mainly Methodist women start destroying property in Centerville. And so here you see a March 30th account that runs in the April 2nd Ottumwa Semi-Weekly Courier, describing this group of women going with axes, and they also have a gentleman, John Daly, and that they're smashing up drugstores that are selling liquors and going to saloons. So here's a group of about a dozen women who, and it does reference that they're followers of Mrs. Nation, and so they are going around and destroying property in the town of Centerville. So this is incident 1, late March. Then April 13th is the newspaper account from the Centerville Daily Citizen this time, saying the Carrie Nation Hatchet Brigade was out again in force in South Centerville last evening. So April 12th, they're out again. And John Daly is the only man with them, but it's a group of mainly Methodist women who are going around the town and breaking up saloons. And so police are trying to stop them, and in fact, they're able to deter them at times, but in general, these women are successful at destroying saloons. One of the stories is they go into a billiard hall and they can't find anything, so they start bashing up the floor, and there they find the hidden liquor inside the building, hidden beneath floorboards. So it talks about this attack, and the reason why I knew this one, you can see it actually on the 3rd column, or the 3rd part of the clipping on the right side. it ran on page 3, and the jump to the article actually goes to page 2, just the way the layout was done by the newspaper at the time. So it says continued on second page. And so here's the jump talking about what they're doing, and in that section talking about women singing and praying, that second column on the left side, saying, while smashing the joints, they called upon God to assist them and give them strength to do their work. And at times when a joint was completely wrecked, they would sing a hymn of joy. One woman, while in front of Tiger Row, became very happy and clapped her hands and called on the sinners to repent. Many of the women talked to the liquor men and others, urging them to be converted and lead better lives. But on the right side of the column, this was the story I knew, was that they went to another drugstore called the Red Cross drugstore in Centerville. It was operated by Carl Weeks, who went on to build Salisbury House with his wife Edith in Des Moines. But in 1901, Carl Weeks had a drugstore in Centerville, and they got to Carl's drugstore. They bought some cough drops, and he was not illegally selling alcohol. And so presumably to show that they supported him because he was following what they saw as appropriate behavior, they only bought cough drops at Carl Weeks' drugstore. And so here you see really disruptive, violent behavior by a group of women in the name of prohibition and temperance, taking vigilante action. And a newspaper reporter was assaulted, the man covering this story for the Centerville paper. He got crossways with one of the people who was trying to protect their property and had an argument in the past with him. So you saw a reporter be assaulted in this set of incidents. And if you'll notice, it does say that the women left the square going south on South 11th Street to their homes, ate their suppers, and afterwards attended a prayer meeting at the Free Methodist Church, to which most of them belong. So again, these were largely Methodist women. And when you talk about vigilante, violent behavior, I don't think of Methodist women generally when you talk about that. So another incident where things are really disruptive. And in fact, they do have a party then later in the month where at the church, at the Presbyterian church, they gather and they have a Carrie Nation party where colored paper hatchets are distributed, and they have a game where they try to think of words that end in the word nation, such as consternation and vaccination, and the winning group received a prize of carnations. So they really were modeling themselves after Carrie Nation's behavior. Well, the Republican Party does continue to be the spokes group for temperance. And so here's the party platform of 1910 saying, temperance laws in Iowa have been promoted, extended, saloon influence minimized, and there'll be no step backward in any degree to imperil the moral welfare of the state with the Republican Party. It also, again, continues with some of that progressive reform of to have direct election of senators as the next plank within the platform. As we said, there had been local option in Iowa through 1915. The legislature in the 1915 session changes that. So here you see the Ottumwa Tri-Weekly Courier from January 1st, 1916. Second column from the left, bargain sales at Iowa's bars. Saloon keepers dispose of their stocks in order to close their places. So again, Iowa is a leader in this reform movement, and liquor is illegal, beer is illegal in Iowa beginning January 1st, 1916. So the national prohibition movement that takes place and is enacted on January 17th, 1920. Sorry about the quality of the cartoon there. That's a Ding Darling cartoon from the Des Moines Register showing people flocking to Cuba. That shining other shore where departed spirits, pun intended, dwell has taken on a new meaning for some people. So joking as Ding Darling is depicting it with people from the US going to Cuba to satisfy their desire for alcohol. And then with the challenges with enforcing prohibition that I chose not to get into, that could be a talk all on its own. There's a reason why Templeton Rye comes around, and other local production is done through the 1920s and 1930s, and raids take place all across the state. But in 1933, Prohibition is repealed, and then it's up to individual states to enact their laws. So if you were in southern Iowa, you actually could get beer earlier, because South Lineville, Missouri, which is on the other side of the street of Lineville, Iowa, was able to sell liquor beginning on April 8th or April 7th. And so the Register has this cartoon by Dean Darling showing old man beer coming back because on April 7th, you could get alcohol in Lineville. And so the April 8th Des Moines Register shows men in Lineville, Missouri, 500 feet from the Iowa line, drinking their 3.2 beer. And that is the return of alcohol then in 1933 to Iowa. The Iowa law passes later in April. So by April, I think it's 20th or thereabouts, you can get beer in most communities across the state. But the Register sent a reporter down to Lineville and covered the end of Prohibition, at least in that Iowa town. And part of that then, and part of the legacy why we have the Iowa Alcohol Division today, the IABD, if I've got that right, IABD, there we go, yeah, Iowa Alcoholic Beverage Division, goes back to the 1933 and 34 creation of the state control of liquor. So that's part of that legacy of hard liquor still needs to be controlled. And so we had state liquor stores into the 1980s in Iowa, had 3.2 beer into 2010 in Iowa. So it's a legacy we live with today. Liquor by the drink wasn't legal in Iowa until Governor Hughes and the legislature changed that in 1963. So this is a story that continues to shape our state. We all encourage people to drink responsibly, but I think for the most part, we're happy with the way things have developed over the last 30 years. And with that, I'll say thank you and wrap up and give us a little bit of time for questions. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Leo. We have a few minutes to answer some questions at this time. However, before I ask the first question, I want to remind our participants that you can submit your questions to the Q&A feature here right on the screen. We are on a schedule though, so please note we may not be able to get to all the questions before the end of the webinar, but we'll try our best. So here's our first question, Leo. What prompted the focus on temperance in Iowa? Was it a reaction to something else, an event or a disaster?
It really did go back to the Second Great Awakening as a reform movement within religion and the evangelical religious movements of the early 1800s. Methodism was founded with abstaining from alcohol. That was part of their book of discipline through, it's been adjusted a little bit, but I have, my wife was raised Methodist, still is active at times. And so it really came out of the Protestant Reformed traditions. And because so many of our early settlers with European ancestries had that tradition, and even the African-American early settlers tended to be pro-temperance as well. So it was that reform movement going back to the early 1800s that shaped our state, and the Republican Party being a reform party connected to abolition of slavery, that was the foundation, but also then latching on to other reform movements, and that the Democratic Party was really the party of Catholics and non-temperance folks, and with Republicans being so dominant in our state's politics, and temperance and prohibition being part of their political ethos, that really was the nexus on which, and sorry to use words like that, but that really was the focus of why Prohibition played such a big role in our state, is because the role of the Republican Party and its roots as a reform party.
Leo, you referenced some vigilante activity within your talk. What have you found out about the Pierce gang in Des Moines?
That was a gang in Des Moines that really almost engaged in extortion in Des Moines in the late 1880s and early 1900s. And there's some good references to it in the Glenn Erstein article that I talked about. The Pierce gang would keep an eye on drugstores, watch people who had purchased liquor from that drugstore, believed to purchased liquor, and then go to the home. There's a terrible story of a woman who was on her deathbed and was drinking schnapps to help ease her pain. And they raid the home in Des Moines. They can't find it, and then they realize, oh, maybe she's laying on it. They order this woman on her deathbed to get out of bed. She can't, so they pull her off her bed. They find the liquor bottle underneath her. They take her husband to prison, and he, because if you could prove someone had alcohol, you would earn a fee in the city of Des Moines. And so Pierce's gang was finding this alcohol, proving people were misusing it or having access to it. And so Pierce, there were shootings connected to him. It really was just tragic and awful. The woman ended up dying while her husband was in prison in Des Moines, or being held by the police in Des Moines. And so a really tragic story in that case of vigilante behavior.
It's interesting to hear that going on in Des Moines. You don't think you'd hear about it in our area, more like Chicago at that point. So you referenced people who were members of the temperance movement. We've met some people along with your talk. Now a question comes up, were African-American members of the temperance movement as well?
They were, and again, because of the segregation and the racist nature of mainstream society, whereas an African-American Methodist minister would have been supported in his activity, their temperance groups were generally segregated. So, and they were affiliated with the Republican Party too. So you did not see a lot of cross intersection between African Americans and Euro American groups. They're generally not integrated, and you have to think of the larger towns too, where there'd be a larger African American population that might be present. But if there was an African Episcopal Methodist church, an AME church, Methodist Episcopal Church, they tended to support temperance and prohibition as well.
Now, discussing, they're kind of like the hand in hand of suffrage and temperance. Why do you think suffrage lasted and was successful, and then prohibition failed to survive?
I think it's all about liberty and equality, that suffrage, anybody who is of a certain age of judgment, whether it be 18, 19, or 21, can make choices about voting. You could even make the argument about any age. And so that's expanding liberty to an equality on a constitutional right. Well, the idea that the state or the government prohibiting something, that's an infringement on liberty. And so instead of infringing on liberty on the vote, we've expanded it. And you could say the same thing. They're both successes. We've expanded liberty again in both ways. We tend to try to, we hope, expand liberty. And so suffrage has been expanded. Alcohol consumption has been liberalized. And I mean that in a way of, making it more acceptable.
Perfect. So we have about time for one last question, and I'll make it an easy short one for you, Leo. Was there an age restriction on alcohol in the past?
There was. One of the accounts I read from Waterloo, though, talked about a temperance group who was monitoring activities at Waterloo saloons and seeing children, boys, under the age of 16 inside of a saloon. So usually it was typically 16. Later, as it's liberalized to being legal after 1933, it's 21.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Leo. And with that answer, this is all the time we have for today's webinar. Thank you again to Leo for leading our lecture this afternoon. I say this every time we have these, but I know I can say this has been a very informative lunch and I'm walking away learning a lot of new things. Also, thank you to everyone who joined us today. We hope everyone can join us in the upcoming weeks and over the whole entire summer for future programs hosted by the museum. Our next webinar in this series will be on July 9th, and it will continue through August at this time. There are many great stories from Iowa's past to tell in the upcoming months. For more information and to register for our future webinars in this series, check out our website at iowaculture.gov. And while you're there, you can look into some of our other fantastic digital programs, such as the weekly Goldie at Home activities for young historians, or watch video recordings of our lecture series and the Iowa Story series, which is hosted by our Iowa City branch. There's pretty much something for every age of a historian there. Thank you all again for joining us today and have a great afternoon. We look forward to virtually seeing you all again on the next 19th Amendment Centennial Celebration webinar right here on Zoom with us on July 7th. Thank you all.